Take a breath.
Yes, okay.
Okay, so is this on? It's fine.
Hit
Okay.
the button on the side. Yeah. There is a button. So push the button.
Hello.
All right.
All right. So this presentation stems from my thesis project, which I've been working on this semester, which is titled, for now, Bombs Fell Like Rain, the Hmong Secret War and the Reckless Aftermath. Content warnings, of course. There was another IID conference last year, and I presented on Myanmar's current civil war, and all of my photos and my quotes and like my personal accounts were from these thousands of Burmese people who had posted on Reddit. These people who posted these updates about the conflict every single day in this intense detail. And sometimes we don't treat it like it is, but the internet is the biggest receptacle for primary sources that has ever existed. It gives us a more intimate look into people's personal histories than ever before. It's a community bulletin board for the whole world. It's a million different newspapers. It's billions of different photos from billions of different angles. And the excess can sometimes make it seem meaningless. How do you begin to make sense of it all? And do you even start to try? There are many ways that you could begin a story about Laos, and specifically about the Hmong. In 1954, for example, with Dwight Eisenhower's famous domino speech that would propel this tiny unknown kingdom to the top of US foreign policy concern. You go 10 years later when the US would begin a decade-long bombing campaign that has made Laos to date the most bombed country per capita in the history of the world. But it's because of the internet and a couple of photos and blog posts and accounts that I found that the story I'm going to tell begins in Fort Worth, Texas in the year 1999. Picture a supermarket about half the size of a soccer field. It's called La Mexia. It serves a low-income area, opened up a few years ago by a family of immigrants. Now imagine one day the family disappears. The supermarket doors lock, and everyone assumes they went bankrupt and packed up business. And then the smell starts. It's the sour stench of rot that takes just a couple of days to spread throughout the entire neighborhood. It's the smell of vomit, of curdled dairy, of dead cattle left to dry in the sun. And the entire neighborhood realizes the immigrant family left, but they also left something behind. After declaring bankruptcy, the owners of La Mexia locked the doors and disappeared, leaving an entire supermarket filled to the brim with fresh food to rot in the hot Texas sun. While the owners' names have largely been lost to time, Fort Worth residents report that the family were Laotian immigrants who returned back home after their business failed. And I'm going to read now an account by a Fort Worth resident on an online forum called "Do You Ever Have Nightmares About the Ghetto?" Quote, "A supermarket in this one low-income area of town just closed one day. The doors locked, the owners left the country and went back to Laos. They just locked the doors and left. They left all the food out. The fish was still in the coolers, the meat counter filled with meat, the produce still out. The electricity was shut off. It stood like that for a couple months. It was the images on the news that gave me bad dreams. Windows blackened by millions of roaches, rats in swarms. Milk cartons exploded because the bacteria inside pressurized and burst. The cleanup team donned hazmat suits and gas masks. And at the end of the day, the question that remains is who were these people? And why did a family seemingly overnight pack up and head back to Laos without clearing out the remains of their family business? And the short answer is we're never going to know for sure. The circumstances that allowed for a biohazard to fester for months. The family's exact reasons for such an abrupt departure. There are no concrete conclusions that can be drawn from the information available, but the larger refugee crisis going on at the time as a result of the secret war might be able to give us a loose idea of what maybe could have happened. The more known and publicly understood refugee crisis of the time was the influx of people coming out of Vietnam from 1975 onwards. 15 years of violence gave birth to a life for Vietnamese refugees that was far from easy. The thriving small businesses and communities they were able to establish in the US remained a testament to their strength in periods of unimaginable hardship. Unbeknownst to many, however, was a parallel refugee crisis occurring at the same time that drew far less support from the public or the US government. The Hmong, who were considered kind of the stepchildren of the Vietnamese and the stepchildren of Southeast Asia, as they've been referred to, lacking education and connections that some other groups had at the time. The illicit nature of the war in Laos marked them as ineligible to be considered as US allies, and thus made the process of gaining refugee status much more difficult. Many Hmong had to be evacuated clandestinely, sometimes by former CIA operatives who felt sympathy or guilt at their situation. And the ones left behind were subject to the brutality and genocidal acts of the victorious communist regime, or were left stranded in refugee camps along the Mekong River. It was the Hmong who bore the brunt of the effects of the secret war, made even more tragic in a sense by the fact that it was through collaboration with them that the war was able to be kept secret in the first place, which is kind of what I'm trying to get at with my thesis. That basically by partnering with this disparate ethnic group and arming them and training them for their own interests, they bypassed any kind of hindrances that might have come through working with the Royal Lao government. On one hand, because they were largely inefficient and corrupt, but also to avoid violating the Geneva Agreements of 1954 and 1962. And it is in this lens that secrecy becomes the defining trait of the relationship between the Hmong and the US, having tangible impacts on their post-war conditions and livelihoods, either in their ability to settle abroad or to find a semblance of peace at home. And this is La Mexia again. And what I found so interesting about coming across this is that in the singular story of this unnamed Laotian family, which has been mostly considered lost media on the internet, we can actually find a really common situation for many Laotian refugees in that they weren't able to establish themselves and prosper in the US. And at the same time, it's actually a very apt way, almost a metaphor, to imagine the state of Laos at the end of the war, to put it really bluntly, as a CIA dumping ground, left to breed all kinds of trouble in its own right. So starting in America, the Hmong are traditionally a nomadic people, but today, as a result of the secret war, they've never been so spread far and wide, farther and wider than ever before. Today, there exist about 300,000 Hmong in the US, and to date, they remain one of the worst faring refugee groups, full stop, in terms of crime, poverty, homelessness, mental illness, and suicide. And it's often these really mundane seeming documents like the ones pictured here that can reveal a lot about the nature of the war, the aftermath, and the idea of secrecy. These kind of accounts that I'm going to talk about draw a lot from primary sources in a book that I'm using for my thesis. A lot of Hmong came to the States and their intake forms descriptions would kind of be very vague and say like soldier or military, no indication of any kind of war that they were fighting for, who they were allied with, of course. One person's documents from this book that I was talking about, under their information, it said, wounded right knee, now no problem. So it's like enough to kind of prove military service, but not enough to disqualify you from resettlement. Divorce records have been another thing. The Hmong face the disadvantage of having polygamy as a common cultural practice. So men with multiple wives would divorce them upon entry into the US. And it might not like sound like a huge deal when you think about it, but when you're steeped in this tradition and you've built families and lives on this concept, it's like there's no way to morally do that, right? Even if it's necessary for survival. Some Hmong were given veteran ID cards, which is good because you access benefits and things like that. But like, think of how strange that is. It's this really conventional form of recording participation in a conflict for this war that was anything but conventional. And the author of the book that I was talking about makes a really good point in that these are things that are worn on people's bodies, right? Like they're kept in wallets. They're a personal archive more than anything else. And in a sense, they reveal more than any documents about the war really could, because even declassified things about this engagement in Laos are still heavily redacted. And I would say that it's probably these stories here that are, among refugees in the States that are the most dominant. But really, the question is what becomes of the people left behind? So pivoting now to Laos as a whole. There's a photojournalist named Jane Hamilton Merritt who lived in the Ban Vinai refugee camp in the late 70s. I'm using her for my thesis as well. And she describes the Mekong River as this kind of Berlin Wall of Southeast Asia that separates Laos communist from Thailand, which is non-communist, where many Hmong would attempt to escape to freedom after the war or otherwise die trying. Refugee camps popped up around the periphery of the river from the mid-70s, packed with the human debris or the human residue of the conflict. Struggles were the same as many refugee or prison camps around the world. Food was scarce, disease rampant, but with a unique war came unique hardships. Quote, on March 25th, 1979, 2 jets flew low over our prison camp and sprayed us with white rain. 100 people died immediately. The rest had diarrhea for 2 days, then fever. We cannot walk nor raise our arms. Many more people die. The poison gas, or poison rain, as it came to be called, became a facet of life in the camps. The evidence for this being a program of biological warfare implemented by the Pathet Lao and the North Vietnamese was insurmountable, but went largely uninvestigated at an official level. And it's not my intention either to dehumanize the Hmong by referring to them as debris or residue of the conflict, but rather to illustrate that this is really how they were treated. The Hmong, and I would argue the entire state of Laos, are absolutely inseparable from the vast living archive of military waste that the CIA left behind in their departure. Think of the neglect present at a story like La Mexia and apply it to an entire country. And what do people do with waste? They repurpose it. So this is a cluster bomb, which is refashioned as a bell at a monastery. These are, the next couple slides are drawings, but they're drawings of real things. So this is kind of used in homes, in gardens and personal projects and things. People melt it down. They turn it into cutlery, into jewelry and other consumer goods. If you went to Laos also, it would not be uncommon to see display cases of old bombs and shell casings and other artifacts in family restaurants or in corner stores, used as kind of like a tourist trap, driving up business. But not everything left behind can be repurposed. I am, of course, referring to the approximate 80 million tons of unexploded ordnance mosaicked in every corner of the country. These are the remnants of the bombing campaign that saw more US bombs dropped on Laos during the secret war than on Germany and Japan combined during all of the Second World War. They nest beneath the rubble. They're silent, they're unfeeling. They kill and maim dozens of people every year. And it's estimated that over 45% of victims of UXO accidents are children. Hmong living in Laos continue to be viewed with suspicion and hostility by the government, routinely subject to arrest, harassment, and torture. Many Hmong have also been forcibly repatriated from Thailand, despite warnings from human rights organizations about the treatment they would face. And most Hmong who were directly involved in the secret war on the front lines are dead now. But it's for all of those reasons that I outlined above that some of their descendants in Laos are actually still fighting. Still armed with rifles provided and then abandoned by the CIA, there are communities of Hmong that remain in the jungle, hidden in mountainous regions, and routinely clash with the Laotian authorities to avoid persecution, even after all these years. During his time as president of the US, Barack Obama was famous, at least later on, for making efforts to engage with Southeast Asia, not only to forge stronger partnerships in trade, but to own up to a legacy of desertion and destruction, especially in Laos. And not every story is bleak either. There are Hmong who have resettled and gone on to successful careers, built family, community, and continue to advocate for further reparations. But things are not looking so great right now. With cuts to foreign aid by the Trump administration, a lot of critical funding has been lost for UXO removal, for example, and for NGOs and nonprofits dedicated to helping victims. And for refugees. Since the beginning of Trump's promises to deport, quote, millions and millions of people, the Hmong community has kind of been patiently holding their breath. And unfortunately, it seems that some of their worst worries are beginning to be realized. This woman's name is Ma Bang. She's a Hmong woman who lives in Milwaukee, and she was born in a refugee camp in Thailand and was brought to the US at just a couple months old. In 2020, she was convicted and she served out a full sentence for marijuana-related charges. Full sentence, like done. And she acknowledges in interviews and she says, I made a mistake and I served my time for it and I'm done. And just last week, to the surprise of her family and her lawyer, her green card was revoked and she was deported to Laos, which, if you'll remember, is a country that she's never been to. And that's her with her family there. The period of the Vietnam War was an explosive moment in US history, but it's one that's kind of faded into the periphery of American public consciousness and memory. The aftermath of the secret war, however, which I've tried to demonstrate, affects Laotians and Hmong every day. It's an ever-present facet of their lives. The aftermath is a country left with scars on the land that might never fully heal, a bad smell that never ceases. The aftermath is a cultural conscience, home and away, that searches through the rubble for community, for reparations, for peace. The aftermath's widespread calamity is something that I understand through the struggle of a single Laotian family's story, the abandonment of La Mexia. Fish in the coolers, the meat counter filled with meat, refugees being uprooted from their lives, bombs littering the plain of jars, and Hmong people, scattered like poppies among the mountaintops, still fighting a war that has been over for more than 50 years. Thank you.
Questions? You wanna go?
I've got a couple, yeah, I mean, fantastic presentation, no notes, just
Yeah.
amazing, well done, oh my gosh. I'm wondering, I got one bigger question on context, I'm gonna leave that to the end. What is your assessment of the Hmong community in the US today? Are they given chance to be kind of a united diaspora? Is there kind of like a community around activism for their own rights to stay, or are they too sort of disjointed and kind of unprivileged to have that?
I think in terms of like, I think now, like obviously things are a lot better. They've been here for a couple generations. They're definitely like, if we're talking like purely geographical, they're the most, I think, concentrations in Minnesota and California. So that's where they kind of mostly are. I think in terms of opinions of what went on and kind of activism for themselves and for people back home, it's been difficult because what I've been gathering is that the older generation really kind of venerates Vang Pao, who was their commanding kind of general during the Secret War. And he was this guy who, like, a lot of authors have really likened him to this kind of archetypical Southeast Asian warlord of like, he was very violent and, you know, things like that. And he made a lot of mistakes and he did a lot of things that did not benefit the community at all. He came to the US and he lived in Montana on a ranch. And he would advocate for kind of taking back the country from the communist leadership and stuff. But he would take money from people and he would promise them, like, if you give me this amount of money, I'll give you this political position when I go back and I take over the country. So he, you know, he's a really contested figure. And I think a lot of the legacy of the Secret War has to do with people's opinions around him and what he did. So like I was saying, like the older generation generally still kind of venerates him and sees him as this really great, you know, force. Whereas the younger generation of Hmong who have grown up in the US and who are very exposed to, like, you know, and I feel like that's the thing with Gen Z too, is every single struggle is like interconnected, like as a result of internet, social media, really seeing their own personal histories in the lens of other things that have gone on and who understand that this guy was not the greatest. So yeah, I think there's a definitely huge divide between the old and the younger generation in terms of how they come to grips with something like this. But I think generally, like, there's a lot of pride. There's a lot of Hmong, like, cultural pride. I think no matter who you talk to, it's obviously changed and adapted now that they're refugees and adjusted to a new life. But yeah, I'd say on the surface, it's a very strong presence in terms of culture and kind of stuff like that. But kind of underneath, there are different considerations that you have to think about. Something that I didn't mention was in the murder of George Floyd in 2020, one of the 4 officers who was present was actually Hmong American. And it kind of like thrust their community to the forefront in this Black Lives Matter struggle. It brought up a lot of stuff about the Secret War and kind of how they managed to integrate into the country. And I don't know, it was really interesting because I feel like the tensions between the Black and the Asian American community in the US can get pretty high sometimes. And it really exacerbated a lot of that, especially from people who didn't otherwise know about the Hmong or where they came from or kind of the circumstances of their arrival in the US. Sorry, that was kind of long. But
No, I think that's great. Apart from the United States, and I know you mentioned Thailand as well, where did most Hmong refugees wind up?
Thailand and the US. Some in Canada, like not that many. Australia and New Zealand, I'm pretty sure. And then I'm blanking. think Germany. Yeah. Yeah.
Mostly it's workers.
Yeah.
Yikes. You have a penchant for topics that are on the unknown scale for most of us. And what I love most about it, Jordan, is your sense of outrage. It's like seething and it's great. And I just gotta say that, like that really brings it. It's not always welcome when you're an academic because you gotta be neutral and objective, but you she did work on Burma as well, on Myanmar, I suppose. Where a genocide has taken place over decades, and most of us in the West have absolutely no knowledge whatsoever. That is doubly true for the Hmong, because nobody even knows about them. So, if you could just kind of quickly, can you speak to the like the ethnic relations, like who are they relative to, especially the lowland Lao, right? The dominant proportion of people that live in that country.
Yeah. So basically the Hmong they originated from China. So there are the most amount of Hmong actually live in China. I think it's something like 4 million nowadays. But basically what happened is they were always kind of nomadic, but because of the Han Dynasty and a couple of other things that happened in kind of like, I think it was like mid 1800s, they were kind of expelled from that region, a lot of them, and migrated further down to Thailand and to Laos. And I think honestly, it's important to put them in the context of like ethnic relations or ethnic even stereotypes within all of Southeast Asia, because I think, what am I trying to say? I think in Southeast Asia, the sentiment that was, I think, especially reinforced and perpetuated by French colonialism in the region is that Vietnamese are like the model minority in terms of them being better educated. For whatever reason, their stereotype was that they were kind of like the best of Southeast Asia. And then it put these other countries, like Laos, for example, on kind of the periphery of that. And Lao people were kind of seen by the colonial authorities as less than. And even like in the nature of colonialism, French colonialism in Laos, like it really just kind of floated over top of the regular administration. Like it didn't, not to say it didn't do much, but they really weren't concerned with Laos at all, just for kind of like a racial and ethnic reason as well. So if Laos were not as much of people as Vietnamese were, then Hmong were basically subhuman. And that's the case for a lot of different countries in Southeast Asia, where the ethnic minorities are really just seen as like, nothing. And I guess, sorry, just take the question.
No, you answered my question. I was asking about the nature of their relationship ethnically. I mean, they speak a different language, of course,
Yeah.
not Buddhist by and large, right?
And they live in the kind of upper regions mostly and the mountains, and they're still like nomadic. But yeah, entirely deprivileged in terms of like no participation in like regular government, discriminated against in society. And Laos in general, like it's just one of the most, I would say, disadvantaged countries by colonialism and in Southeast Asia. They didn't even have a newspaper until like after the Second World War, like a print newspaper, because the literacy levels were so low.
Poorest country in Asia.
Yeah.
So they're the poorest of the poorest of the poorest. Anybody? Otherwise, it's one-way dialogue.
I've got one question.
Okay.
Again, on the topic of this being something that many people don't know a lot about, can you maybe contextualize? I know I'm only giving you 6 minutes to do this, but the secret war and
Yeah.
how that impacted Laos, like why is any of this happening now?
I'll give like a, what is it, Spark Notes called? Yeah.
Sure.
So Dwight Eisenhower in 1954 kind of had this theory that was like, if one country in Southeast Asia falls to communism, then all the rest are going to follow suit. That, of course, was not true because of regional and cultural differences and stuff like that. But kind of what they propelled Laos to be is like this, like border between like communism, and if Laos fell, then they thought Vietnam would fall and Burma and all the others. So what they did is there were Geneva agreements in place that had Indochina as a neutral territory. But they wanted to, the communists were still in the region. They didn't care. So they wanted to circumvent these Geneva agreements, and they basically thought, Bill Lair, this CIA guy, found the Hmong after training people in Thailand and figuring out that they accustomed really well to that type of thing. Kind of came across the Hmong and were like, what if we train these guys the same way that we train the Thais, and we use them to fight our war? And that was kind of what happened for 10 years, where they would train Hmong to be pilots, paratroopers, like other sorts of things like that. And then fight with them against the North Vietnamese who would come in through like the north of the country. Yeah, and then towards the end, like it was kind of an on and off thing for multiple years, where neither side really had a clear upper hand, but the Vietnamese gained like a really distinct upper hand in 1969. And essentially after realizing that the Hmong were not going to win the war, it became a question of how many of them can we get to substitute for American bodies so we don't lose as many Americans in Vietnam. And that was really kind of what I argue is like the context of the end of the war. It ended in 1973. But yeah, that's kind of a summary of like the conflict. It was secret because it was CIA, it was paramilitary, so it was not involving like the official, like the US. There were no American troops on the ground. And obviously, due to it being a secret war, as I explained, it's left them in a very disadvantaged position.
And they're still fighting it. They're still Hmong fighting, which is crazy. The Americans left 50 years ago.
Those are from 2014.
Yeah, I know.
Those pictures.
I won't forget, but there is one little tidbit for your thesis. There's an Australian broadcasting crew company that was doing a documentary on deer, of all bloody things in the world, like a deer species that they've just discovered.
Okay.
This would have been the late 80s, maybe early 90s. And they came across Hmong in the mountain, and the Hmong thought that they were the CIA coming back to rescue them. How depressing is that? It's like seriously,
Yeah.
like 40. And I saw the show and talked to the when I wrote the book on Laos, that's who I talked to, and they said it was the most heartbreaking thing they ever imagined. Why don't people give a crap?
And in the camps too, like the refugee camps, it was all this talk of like, and I'm kind of reading like Jane Hamilton Merritt kind of does things from like a personal account, like in a lot of her kind of work. So a lot of what she was talking about was like, sure, there was the regular like the struggles of being in a refugee camp and all that stuff that she saw, but the sentiment was like, where are our friends? Where are these people that we worked with for 15 years? She says something, she's like, gone were the star-spangled, sleek American jets that used to fill the skies or whatever. You know, she's very poetic about it, but it's like very true in a sense where it's like, you know, we were fighting with these guys for such a long time and, you know, had nicknames for them, Colonel Billy and all that. And it's like they were just totally gone without an explanation. And yeah.
I'll show you. Okay, thank you, Lindy. So while we wait for the others to come here to come, do me one favor, go and get food. There are, I swear to God, I paid for it, you must take it, otherwise it goes to waste. There's little takeout containers, use serviettes, stuff them down your shirt, I don't care. Just don't take cutlery and stuff like that, all right? Go now and then come back because we're gonna have some last comments.
Hello, Professor.
Hey, how are you?
Doing
Good
well.
to see you, buddy. Good.
Yeah,
Everything good?
yeah, doing well. Yeah,
Good.
I went to come earlier, but I had a moment. Presentation.
Yeah, yeah. You
I
do not need to, well, go get some of these.
will. I hope it's going on.
Oh.